We are following breaking news. The White House has now issued a timeline for when President Trump will decide whether to take action against Iran. This is Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt just moments ago.
Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks.
Now, in the meantime, Iran claims that it's shooting down Israeli drones over Tehran. And moments ago, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to strike all of Iran's nuclear facilities. Let's go to CNN's Clarissa Ward, who is live for us in Israel. Clarissa, does Israel believe that Trump has 2 weeks' time to make a decision?
Well, we haven't yet had, Brianna, any official reaction here in Israel to this news, this 2-week timeline. But I can tell you, based on conversations I've been having previously, that this is not what Israeli officials want to hear. They had been feeling quietly optimistic. They had given timelines of 24 to 48 hours. I think there's a sense from the Israeli perspective that you have to act when you have the momentum, and that slowing things down and allowing for diplomacy, which is very much the favored option for much of the world, but not here in Israel, that carries a cost with it in terms of potentially losing that momentum. The other question, of course, Brianna, becomes how much firepower does Israel have in terms of keeping up the same level of strikes against Iran, and can they keep that going at the same pace for another 2 weeks? So this will really be an open question now in terms of how Israeli officials interpret it, and also how they officially respond to it, because it's been notable that up until this point they have been very careful about not explicitly advising the U.S. to get involved, about not wanting to be seen as trying to strong-arm President Trump or push him to make one decision or another. The sort of party line, if you like, has been very much to say that they are grateful for all the assistance that the U.S. has given up until now, primarily in a defensive capacity, and that they are, waiting and watching to see what President Trump decides. So, as I said before, this 2-week timeline, unlikely to be very popular here in Israel. But as we have seen so many times with President Trump, this could well be some kind of an obfuscation tactic. It's not clear whether this really means that there is now some room for diplomacy to try to play out and to slow down the dramatic escalation, Brianna, that we have seen over the last week.
Yeah, very good point. Clarissa Ward, thank you so much. Let's go now to CNN's Kristen Holmes, who was in that White House press briefing. Kristen, just tell us about what you are observing here. The president likes to talk, as Clarissa said, about 2 weeks so often. It's hard to really put stock in what he's saying here, or what his quote was as delivered by the White House press secretary.
Yeah, that's right, Brianna. But you have to remember here, we're talking about a very specific thing. In the past, when he's used this 2 weeks, it's been kind of vague, or I can tell you down the road if Putin wants peace in 2 weeks. He is saying here, and this is something we're going to hold him accountable to, I'm making a decision in 2 weeks if we cannot get to the table on some kind of deal here. I mean, that is a very specific time frame. Now, we're actually trying to get more answers on this. Does that mean that he is going to authorize strikes on Iran at the 2-week mark if no deal is reached? She would not answer that. I asked the question of, we have heard from U.S. officials and Israeli officials that they believe Iran never wants to make a deal, that they are going to just string us along. How can you ensure that they are not stringing us along when you are now effectively adding time to the table? Remember, this is now the second deadline they've given Iran. The first one was 60 days. Now they're adding an extra 2 weeks. And there's no real answer to that other than the fact that Karoline Leavitt is saying that the president believes that there is, and I want to say, a substantial chance for negotiation. That's what they use. But we still don't have any idea why exactly they mean that. Now, one of the things she told me is that Iran is incredibly weakened, and that gives them some kind of insight into the potential for a diplomatic deal because Iran has become so weakened. But still, we don't have a lot of answers as to what this means if Iran doesn't come to the table. The other part of this that has been so fascinating is the U.S. Middle Eastern envoy, Steve Witkoff, who we know has been in touch with his Iranian counterparts, has been really leading the talks in this process. He's not attending the talks with European nations on Friday in Switzerland. She did not have an answer for why that was. He has been in touch. We know that the United States has been in touch with Iranians. We still don't know if that's direct or indirect. But why exactly we're not taking part in diplomatic talks between European countries and Iran on Friday, that still also remains to be seen. So we're trying to piece together what it means at the end of a 2-week deadline. And again, as you said, yes, Donald Trump uses this a lot, but this is a very specific thing that he is giving 2 weeks for. And there's still questions as to what if this is what he wants diplomacy, what happens if they don't come to the table? Is he going to extend again? And we simply don't know the answer to that. One thing we do know, though, is that Donald Trump behind the scenes has said that he does not want to enter into a long-term war, into a long-term conflict in the Middle East. So clearly here he is using that going forward and saying he's not doing anything, giving 2 weeks for negotiations.
We have Jeff Zeleny with us, as well as Evelyn Farkas. She's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Thanks both for being with us. Jeff, what did you make of these remarks, and specifically that promise of a decision within 2 weeks?
Look, what this is President Trump not necessarily putting the brakes on, but slowing down the conversation that he and his administration are in a rush toward war. He's been hearing a lot of criticism, as we know. Interestingly, Steve Bannon, one of his longtime advisors, came into the White House this morning. Steve Bannon has been leading the charge to get the administration, the president, to not launch military strikes. We don't know what role that played, but what this is the president, and you are right, Brenna, I've lost track of the number of times the 2-week mantra has been used, most recently with Vladimir Putin. He will give him 2 weeks. But I think on this matter specifically, clearly the president is trying to buy himself some time here and to see if a diplomacy can work. But what the question is, what does this do for Israel? Because there has been a sense of urgency. There was an urgent need when you heard some of the hawkish voices like Lindsey Graham and others saying now is the time. Other presidents have not had this moment. President Trump clearly does not see this as urgent as some of the hawkish views do, as Israel clearly sees it. So that is the question. Is this going to sort of just go off into the night here, or is this actively something that the president will sort of stay on top of? The bombing is going to continue with or without U.S. involvement here. So now what we will have to see is what Israel does in response to this. But for now, the big picture here is the president buying himself some time.
Exactly. He's buying time, Evelyn. Israel certainly doesn't believe that he has time on this. What do you think?
Well, I think, Brianna, that he does have some time, certainly, to make a decision about whether to use military force. But I think that that window probably already closed, because at the end of the day, even if you were to bomb the, deep underground and take out those facilities, the Iranians still would need to come to a negotiating table and agree that they're going to abandon their plans for a nuclear arsenal, and that they would, agree to having verification in place. So you still need diplomacy. And I think at this stage of the game, if we use military might, it makes it harder to get to diplomacy. So I predict that we probably will not use force to take out those facilities, and instead we will use diplomacy. But I think the open question is, as your commentator just said, your correspondent, the Israelis, how long do they plan to fight this fight? Because if the United States doesn't exercise its diplomatic might, and if the Europeans fail, then this war, like the war in the Russia-Ukraine context, will continue. So that is the danger, frankly, that the war will continue and that it could actually spread.
Evelyn, please stay with us. Jeff, a quick question to you. We have less than a minute before we go to break, but to Kristen Holmes' question of Caroline Levitt, how do we know Iran isn't stringing the U.S. along?
We don't. We don't know that at all. I mean, in fact, the president himself has suggested that. He said the time for diplomacy has run its course just a couple days ago. So we do not know that. That is certainly part of the history here. But look, this is something that the president, his whole public life over 10 years has been not engaging in this kind of war. So I'm not sure that we should find this all that surprising. Over the last couple days, there has been sort of a rush, but this is more in keeping in lines of his fairly consistent views.